explain. So
Okay.
it's up to you now.
Now I have to figure out what
Yeah.
First of all, let me just thank you all for bearing with English. I'm sorry we don't speak Dutch. That's always embarrassing. We're really pleased to be here. One of the best things about academia is we find each other around the world, and you find somebody that's doing something that interests you, and you phone each other up, and connections like this happen. And I think that that's how we all learn. The second thing I want to say is that transition design is primarily a conversation right now. So how many people in the room have heard of design thinking? Oh, yeah. How many people in the room have heard of service design? Fair enough. Okay, so both of those areas of focus started as a conversation that a few people started batting the concept around, and more people began joining in all around the world. Service design is actually now a bona fide area of design focus and a worldwide network, and it began 27 years ago. And I happen to know that because a few close friends and colleagues were among the first people that started it. So every new innovation or every new body of knowledge in any discipline, whether it's ecology or business or entrepreneurship, began as a conversation. And so we started the discussion about transition design because we felt that the world was facing so many, what the design world calls wicked problems, that it was going to take people from many fields and disciplines, as well as the communities affected by the problems, working together to solve them. And we thought new tools and approaches were necessary to seed and catalyze systems level change. Now we're all aware within our own territories, lots of people are working to make the world a better place. I think everybody in this room showed up probably because of that motivator. But so many times we're working in our own little territories on one-off solutions. And sometimes they're very effective, and sometimes there are a few solutions and you move on. The question that we've been asking is, can many of us together begin a conversation about systems level change? So if design thinking was the big thing that happened within design and related disciplines, 20 years ago, I think systems thinking probably needs to be the next logical step, because the problems we're facing are so urgent and so large. We think that we need approaches and knowledge that will show us how to hook all of these efforts up over long periods of time to result in systems level change. Now, we started working in this way, and immediately we began sharing everything we did, primarily because we wanted other people in other areas of the world to join the conversation with us. Because we don't think any single group of people or any single discipline can solve this problem. The motivator is the fact that cities and regions around the world are facing different complex problems related to unsustainable lifestyles, energy transport systems, and the infrastructure within which they are embedded, and I would add to that, problematic ways of thinking about a lot of things. Transition design argues that one-off solutions that are implemented within separate disciplinary or professional silos or boxes aren't going to work well enough or soon enough in order for cities or entire regions, or I would say even organizations, to transition toward sustainable futures. So how many people have heard of the term wicked problem? Yeah? Excellent. So there are all the characteristics of wicked problems. Many of us have probably studied them for years. And I've always been amazed that the guy who coined the term, Horst Ruttel, kind of said, yeah, there's this really big problems, and they have all of these characteristics, and they're not solvable. So we're not going to think about those problems. We're going to go work on the problems that are solvable. And for a long time, that's how designers thought. It was really, I think, with the understanding that came with complexity and chaos sciences, and Fritjof Capra, a lot of the things that he writes about, that we began to understand the way systems work well enough to begin to think, maybe we can begin to solve for these problems. I would say one of the trickiest is this one right here. Wicked problems are comprised of different stakeholder groups, different groups of people that all have opposing agendas and opinions. I mean, how many of us have ever gone into an organization or worked with a group of people and they can't agree, and what one group fears is what the other one hopes for? Now, my profession, design, does not like to go into that messy, chaotic place very much. We maybe dip our toe in the water a little bit. But we don't want to go in and roll up our sleeves and do the really messy, long-term work required to really get people on the same page, or at least listening to each other enough so that they can begin to create together, to co-design together. So we all know what wicked problems are. This list goes on and on. Many of you mentioned some of these today. And if you're not working on one of these, you're probably working on a subset of one of these. Every one of these problems trickles down systems levels and affects most of us in our everyday lives every day. If you map the system, you would see how. Now the thing about these wicked problems is we can tend to think about them as abstract and living at the global level, but they always manifest in place. Something like homelessness shows up in, I can't say it, Groningen, in a very different way than it does in Pittsburgh. Things like overconsumption, overpopulation, the effects always manifest in specific places in specific ways, but at a larger system level, it's all connected. So part of what we're asking, first and foremost, is can we develop the ability to understand these systems and systems problems, the ways in which they manifest at the lower levels, but can we have the flexibility of mind to go up systems levels to begin to connect the dots? And I'll get to why that's important in a minute. Somebody mentioned forced migration. Here's a inner city in Baltimore that's been completely hollowed out, climate change. And of course, the problems of the modern world. So take a problem like gentrification in Pittsburgh. That is a global problem, but it ripples down systems levels from the global to the national to the regional to the city in particular, but also to the neighborhood and the household. Gentrification shows up on our street in our neighborhood and ultimately affects our lives every day in very specific ways. Another problem, and gentrification, and here's really the important point I'm making. Any wicked problem like gentrification is connected to other wicked problems like homelessness, crime, poverty, lack of access to education, racial profiling, the rising cost of education, and the rising cost of housing. Gentrification manifests in our city in exactly those ways. So if I begin to solve for one of these, I'm also going to begin to solve for that one. So you see where I'm going with this. A problem like childhood obesity becoming a huge global problem. It manifests in Pittsburgh in ways that are probably different than it manifests here. But childhood obesity is connected also to the wicked problems of diabetes, asthma, the fast food industry, social networking, industrial farming, the rising cost of food, sedentary lifestyles, depression, and learning issues. So the minute that you start to understand or read a system system well enough to understand how all of these wicked problems are sitting in a, this is a big term, socio-technical system, you begin to see that these problems are interrelated and interconnected. That is both a problem and a possibility at the same time. So if you look at these two wicked problems and all of the other wicked problems they're connected to, you see immediately that no single discipline is going to be able to solve these, because it's going to involve experts and grassroots workers from all of those areas, as well as the communities affected by it, to begin to address them in a meaningful way. So how are we together going to develop new knowledge sets, new tools, and new approaches that will enable transdisciplinary teams to work with communities to solve these problems, because it took them a really long time to become wicked, and it's going to take them a really long time to get resolved. You're not going to do it in a semester, or a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 4 years. The problem I'm working on right now, I'll probably have to work on it until I'm dead, and then it still won't be solved. So what does it mean to begin to work on problems you may never see resolved? So transition design, we often say, brings together two global means. And one of them is the recognition that entire societies need to begin to transition toward more sustainable futures. And the second is the realization that that is going to call for systems level change and resolution to these wicked problems I've been talking about. So both socio-technical systems and wicked problems are systems. So by socio-technical system, we mean that big tangled mass that we've created out there of infrastructure, interaction, designed artifacts, human interactions, and all of it's embedded within the natural world. And it's complicated, and what the socio-technical research people would argue, most of whom are Dutch, what they would argue is that these big systems are stuck through habits, through infrastructure that can't change, through wrong-headed ideas, and they are now slowly transitioning toward unsustainable futures. So the task is, how do we change their trajectory? And we think it's going to require a deep understanding of the way systems work. So it's important to remember, our societies are always in a constant state of transition. They're always transitioning. The problem is, we only understand the consequences and ramification of those transitions in hindsight. We call it history, and we're always reinterpreting it. But while we're in it, we don't think very hard about where it's going. So the argument is, we need to start thinking hard about where it's going. The problem, of course, is that these big socio-technical systems are slow to change, and we are not very good at seeing systems, let alone understanding how they work. So turning a socio-technical system is a little bit like the Titanic trying to miss that iceberg. You know, the system is too big, and its response time too slow to turn quickly. So we need to get much better at looking way out there, and we also know, hopefully, that when you shoot a rocket to the moon, if you change the trajectory even 1 or 2 degrees, you're going to completely miss the moon and go somewhere else. So even a small adjustment in the trajectory that our socio-technical systems are on will theoretically be helpful. The other piece, socio-technical systems are so ubiquitous, they're invisible to us, and it's best explained by this old joke. bump into each other, and one says, "How's the water?" And the other says, "What water?" Well, Marshall McLuhan, in his book, War and Peace in the Global Village, said, "One thing fish know nothing about is water, since they have no anti-environment that would enable them to perceive the element they live in." So, my argument is systems are to us as water is to fish. Fish couldn't tell you how water works. They don't even see it. I think we don't see systems, and we're not educated to understand how they work. And in fact, our intuition about how they work is often completely wrong, because we have been handed a mechanistic understanding of systems, and they are organic, and they embody the principles of living systems. And I think those are key pieces of knowledge that we need to regain. So complex systems share behavior and dynamics, and it creates possibilities for interventions. We often say that the principle behind transition design is a little bit like acupuncture. How many people have ever been to an acupuncturist? Okay, there's 4 of us. So you go in and you say, "I've got this terrible headache." And the acupuncturist will lay you down on the table, and they'll look at your system. And they'll poke you and look at your tongue and your fingernails. And the pain's here, they might put a needle there. And you're thinking, what the heck are they putting a needle there for? Well, they're putting it there because for over 2,000 years, they have been studying the anatomy and dynamics of this complex system. And they know that if they intervene here, it is going to create a disruption in the system. But they're not going to put one needle in you and be done. They're going to watch you to see how your system responds. And then you're going to go back. And they're going to put another one in there, and another one, and then they're going to wait. Because what they're trying to do is coax your system back into balance. So the theory, in a way, is if we begin to understand the anatomy and dynamics of this complex system, we are going to know where to intervene over time to begin to shift it. I know it sounds crazy, but I can tell you this. There are a group of researchers in Northern Europe, primarily in the Netherlands, who have been trying to map the dynamics of socio-technical systems just like the Chinese acupuncturists did. And these are scientists and engineers. These people are crazy in the level of detail that they have gone into. And we think it's a powerful, powerful tool for those of us that are trying to work toward systems level change. So these are some of the principles that are found in living systems that you can actually observe being present in socio-technical systems. Self-organization, emergence, holarchic structures, symbiosis, feedback loops we were talking earlier about, there's not enough of them. Phase transitions are our big hope. You know, when water boils, turns into steam, or it freezes, phase transition. If enough small actions are happening in a system and they're invisible, if it goes on long enough, the system, boom, will flip. Malcolm Gladwell appropriated that term and called it a tipping point, but it's really just a phase transition from chaos and complexity theory. So this is the way these Northern European researchers think about a system at 3 levels. And this is a very, very famous example that was developed by a fellow named, there we go again, Shields. Okay. So he mapped the transition from the horse-drawn carriage to the automobile. That is a socio-technical transition because it involves technology and people and all kinds of infrastructure changing over time. They argue that large, slow-moving events that can be social, economic, political, cultural, or environmental happen at this level. Down here at the niche level is where small, informal groups of innovators take risks and challenge norms. But this is where the problem is. The regime is where we're stuck. It's all of that out there. It's maybe what you don't like about your university that won't change. It's maybe what you don't like about your government system that won't change. Let me tell you, you'd rather be here right now than where we live. But there's probably many things about these systems you're embedded in that you wish would change and they won't. The regime is where it's stuck, and that's where we have to intervene. And it's networks and groups that are bound by norms and rules that are all embedded within material structures that will not change easily once they're materialized. That's the problem. Our thinking is always way out ahead of our built and materialized structures. They say that transitions in systems happen as a result of large and small-scale events, technological breakthroughs and innovations, and I'll just say, this is what we all want to believe is the most important one right here. We all want to believe that all of our problems can be solved through technology and inventions. But this is really what needs to change here. Changes in beliefs, social norms, and practices in everyday life, and those can change in a moment under the right conditions. And that is an area that we need to work on. So, okay, this is really complicated, bear with me. So, this is the way they map one of these transitions. I've pulled out just one thread in this tapestry to show you how it works. So at the landscape level, electricity was invented, and people got really excited by the possibilities of what it could do. That, in turn, triggered an experiment called the electric tram. And when it first came out, oh, isn't that silly? Isn't that funny? It'll never work. It'll never be adopted. You know, just like the iPad. Everybody said, what do we need that for? We have a computer. So an experiment that's happening down here took hold, and it began to impact the regime. And what did it lead to? Arteries of roads. Transport arteries all over the regime that then eventually enabled cars and other modes of transport. But then what happened? Once it took on, it moved up to the landscape level and became suburbanization. A large trend that has changed the way generations of people live their lives on the planet. So you begin to see how these people have mapped and began to understand the dynamics of these transitions. Here's what they don't do. Their maps are rather agnostic. They don't assign values to them. But every one of these kinds of shifts are connected to wicked problems. So think about the wicked problems connected to suburbanization. I don't know if it's as big a problem in this country as it is in mine, but in mine, it's a big problem. Look at another area. Whoops. So, I'm going to go back here. I left a slide out. So I could also take car culture, fast food malls, and drive-in movies. And I could find a whole other set of wicked problems. I could go down here and say, what are the wicked problems connected to streets as transport arteries? And all of a sudden, you would see all of these wicked problems, and you would see, because the transition was mapped, how they're interconnected and interdependent. That's the point. We have this saying in English called, how do you kill two birds with one stone? You probably have something equivalent here. So the point is, for systems level change, our solutions need to be aimed at solving for more than one problem at a time. And if we begin to map the system, we're going to be asking questions like, can we come up with systems interventions instead of solutions that would simultaneously solve the problem of loss of habitat, traffic and commuting, and pollution? So that, we argue, is an entirely different way of thinking about solving for complex problems, because normally you go, oh God, that is a huge problem. let's get planners on there, let's get the car companies involved, let's get the energy people involved, and you're just hammering away. But the minute that you say, what solutions are at the intersection of these three problems, new possibilities arise that you wouldn't have thought of before. So we, for quite a while now, have been having our master's and doctoral students in the Transition Design seminar map and work with wicked problems in Pittsburgh. And these are the ones that they worked with this year. Isolation of the elderly, lack of access to healthy food, opioid addiction, huge. Poor air quality, and decline of the pollinators. Now, as these students start mapping these problems and learning more about them, but as they start mapping the socio-technical transition in Pittsburgh that led to the problem, without us ever saying anything, they begin to say, wait a minute, this is connected to this, and this is connected to this. And on their own accord, they began talking about the interconnectedness of these. If we had another semester, the logical thing to do would be, what are the interventions, and are there interventions that could solve for all of those problems simultaneously? And that's what one of their maps looked like. So this is the group that mapped a lack of access to healthy food in Pittsburgh. And they went all the way back to pre-1900, and they looked at all of the big events, the events at the regime level, and the small ones that led to the problem today. And then in their futuring exercise, they even added the long-term future to that map. Now, here you get a little bit closer. Now, this kind of research was conducted purely secondarily with desktop research, and they did it in about 3 weeks. We've seen that it will lead to new insights that could inform different kinds of solutions, but what we're saying is, this is really a sketch for research. What we need to be doing is developing new ethnographic and different kinds of field research that will either validate or refute this, and will enable all of us, really, and the communities to conceive of solutions like an acupuncturist that have the greatest potential to move the system, to unstick the solution. This is the socio-technical transition that led to the isolation of the elderly in Pittsburgh. So you can see they're all also experimenting with ways of visualizing these transitions. So, of course, the problem is you can create these ecologies of solutions to these problems and connect them up, but we also argue they need to be connected to visions. Otherwise, what do you want the system to transition to? And that's where visioning and backcasting come in. I mean, I really believe that rigorous futuring is going to become a skill as important as design thinking. The ability to think rigorously about the long-term future, a future in which the problem has been resolved. We got into an interesting conversation this morning about if fear is your motivator for action, if fear is the thing that motivates you to move in new and more sustainable ways, that's not a sustainable thing. You can't live in fear. So one of the things we hypothesize these long-term visions will do is it will help stakeholders transcend their differences in the present. Because you could take any problem and no one in this room would agree on how to solve it. But if you said, okay, let's take that problem and imagine what the future in 75 years would feel like if we solved it. What would be possible that's not possible now? What would it do for our children? What would it feel like? We would agree more than we would disagree. So those long-term visions become both a magnet, drawing us and motivating us toward a co-creative future we can agree on, but it also becomes a kind of roadmap on how to get there. And I'm not going to have time to go into the whole backcasting technique, but we all know that this is what stakeholders can be like. You know, oh, it's a snake. No, it's a tree stump. So stakeholder conflict is often a result of conflicting worldviews, beliefs, and assumptions that are both individual and collective in nature. You would get one group of people that says the state and government should provide for its citizens' basic needs, but you got a whole other bunch of people that say the government should stay the hell out of my business, and it should be very, very small. So essentially, the simplified version is we get stakeholders to together map a wicked problem so that they can see how many different facets of the problem exist. Because one of the biggest problems when you get all these people together is they all believe that there's some magical single solution to it. Forced migration, there's got to be that one single solution. In Ojai, the water shortage, so many of them believe just all we need is $3 billion to build a desalinization plant and we're going to be done. And of course, that's not true. But when you get all of these different people mapping all the facets of the problem, they stand back and they go, holy crap, there can be no single solution to this problem. And oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, and I didn't realize that, and I didn't know that. So if nothing else, you develop an appreciation for complexity in the face of all this contradiction. You envision the long-term future as a way to transcend all those disagreements. And when you backcast to the present, it gives you something that we call a transition pathway toward that desirable future. So what you're doing is creating ecologies of interventions instead of one-off solutions that are connected to each other and this long-term vision. The long-term vision is your North Star. And we all know the rocket to the moon didn't go straight to the moon. The rocket to the moon does this. And it's all about constant course correction, but you have your eye on where you want to go. Now it's more complex than this. When you do these solutions, you wait to see how the system responds, and then you begin the cycle again. Oh, we learned something from all these solutions. Maybe we don't want to go to the moon now. Maybe we want to go to Saturn. So we'll do a few more. Oh, we don't want to go there. We want to go over here now. So this long-term futuring, backcasting, and creating ecologies of interventions becomes an iterative process. So this understanding in the present, informed by a co-created desired future, is a new way of being. How am I doing on time?
Great. Fine.
I'm doing okay? Okay. So we've been trying a lot of these ideas out in Ojai, California. How many people have heard of Ojai? Ever been there? Yeah, it's just north of LA, incredibly beautiful, up in the mountains, and it's filled with orange groves. I've been going there since 1976. I have a real attachment to the place. They came to us because they were in a drought and they only had 2 years of water left, and they have one source of water, which is a man-made reservoir called Lake Casitas. And we ran a couple of workshops in Ojai to introduce the transition design approach with different stakeholder groups, and we asked them, do you think this could help? We showed up and we thought at the very least we'd get some feedback on some of these ideas. We weren't really prepared for them to say, yeah, let's go. Because we didn't have a team, and all of a sudden we'd been invited in and we had to figure out what the next steps were. The next step was we ran a second workshop with different stakeholder groups, and these are some of the stakeholder groups in Ojai. The approach that we are trying to develop really emphasizes that within any ecology, there will be stakeholders whose voices cannot be heard. And that will be either because they're disenfranchised or disempowered, or maybe they're not human, but they're still affected. So anytime an ecosystem is under threat, there are entities that should be considered stakeholders but are not being considered stakeholders. We've all seen that New Zealand has now given rights to rivers. Amazingly, in the United States, they just gave rights to a lake. So how can we develop approaches that, in a way, appoint advocates for other, so that we get comfortable with this idea that we are all in a system that is human and non-human and non-living, and that they're all strands in a web of life. So all of the needs of the stakeholder groups must be surfaced in order to develop responsible interventions. So these are three stakeholders in Ojai that are really at each other's throats. A lower income resident, the owner of a 5-star tourist resort, and a second generation avocado farmer. So imagine water is about as basic as it gets to our survival. So the avocado farmer's been there for generations. He is growing a crop that takes more water than anything else. I mean, avocados suck water out of the ground. And we need more and more avocado trees because the hipsters want avocado on toast in the United States, basically. It's really big, so we're gonna grow more avocados. The owner of the tourist resort is really proud of the fact that he employs people of the middle and lower income level, and he is the backbone of the Ojai economy. And yet, the rich tourists that come to the resort can take 5 showers a day if they want to. But the lower income resident, his water is rationed, and he can barely get by. He can barely pay his bills. So you can see all the contradictions. But if you talk to each of these stakeholder groups about fears and hopes around water, every single perspective makes complete sense, even though they are diametrically opposed. So the lines of conflict and disagreement become really clear. But amazingly, you can also find something that they all agree on. They all love Ojai. They love the ecosystem. They love the lifestyle and the culture. They love the smell of orange blossoms in the summer. And it doesn't matter what socioeconomic or political group you're a member of, they all say the same thing. So the hypothesis is, can you go out there and find areas that they all agree on? Because when you get them trying to co-create their vision of a long-term future, it was amazing how much their visions of the future were in agreement with each other, to the point where they were stunned. It was like, I thought I hated you. And oh my gosh, we want the same thing for our kids. So how can we begin to develop research methodologies and processes that help resolve the lines of conflict and leverage the lines of agreement? And we kind of turned it into a game. All of these groups that started out the workshop kind of look at each other like, oh God, yes. So we had them list all of their hopes and all of their fears. And each group put that up on the board, and then we gave each group a roll of red tape and green tape, and we said, with the red tape, find all of the things that are in disagreement with your group. And they were like, yeah, they're drawing red lines everywhere, you know, what you want, I hate, and they just knocked themselves out. And then we said, here's the green tape, now find places where you agree. And all of a sudden the energy changed, and it was like, oh, well, okay then. We did agree. And all of a sudden, conversations between groups started to happen that hadn't happened before. Now this is anecdotal. It's anecdotal. It didn't solve problems. But as you know, as researchers, what we're trying to figure out is where are the territories in which new methodologies can be developed that try to deal with these very complex stakeholder relations. Now, as if the drought wasn't bad enough, right? In December of 2017, the Thomas Fire nearly burnt Ojai to the ground. And at the time, it was the biggest fire in California history. And having lived in California for more than 20 years, I can tell you we live with fire and earthquakes all the time. This was the mother of all fires. And it burned for weeks. And the colored bit is the chronology of the fire. So, I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of Santa Barbara, which is right there. This wasn't burned. This is a miracle. It's like the donut hole survived against all odds. And Gid and I happened to be in Australia, and we're watching it burn, and we went to bed one night and thought, we're going to get up in the morning, and it will have been wiped off the face of the earth. But it wasn't. So it was spared. The amazing thing about that fire is at its height, it was generating its own weather. It created its own weather vortex, and these people were absolutely traumatized. And it got worse. Because the fire burnt off all the vegetation. I mean, these hills, I was there 2 months after, it looked like an alien landscape. You see all these hills? Not a speck of vegetation on them, and then guess what happened? Rains. Torrential rain showed up. And you can see here the topography. These are fairly tall mountains, and this is coastal shelf. This is one of the wealthiest communities in America. Oprah Winfrey lives right there. So very high mountains, no vegetation, coastal plains, and of course historic washes and rivers that have been coursing through that area for thousands of years. So that was the burn area, and on January 9th, it began to rain. It rained over 1/2 inch in 15 minutes. And city officials warned the people to evacuate. These are natural rivers. Now the other thing you can see is, see any break in the development? No, we're just building houses in natural washes these days. I don't know if you do it here, but we do it all over America. Oh, it's a cute little creek. It's fine. And we don't think about the cycles of the weather. So the rain started coming down, people were told to evacuate, and you know what? Almost no one did. And at 3:30 a.m., tons of mud came down. And this was covered with houses. It came down in the middle of the night, and it killed 23 people. So a couple of things are going on there. They had trauma and evacuation fatigue from the fire, but we are so disconnected from nature now that that community absolutely did not understand that this has probably been a historic flood zone for millennia. And people want to live there, so we're just going to build a house in the wash, and then it's like it's a catastrophe if it floods. It's doing what it's always done. It's certainly exacerbated by climate change, but so much of these systems problems are about the way we think and about our disconnection from natural environments. So it made us realize that the project was not about transitioning Ojai to water security. It's actually about transitioning Ojai to climate resiliency. And that is way more complex. And it is going to involve things like the local indigenous population of Native Americans, the Chumash, are still there. So how were their ancestors managing wildfires? Because California's always had wildfires. How were they farming in ways that did not deplete the water table? So these two are going to have to be transition design approaches, recapturing place-based knowledge and indigenous ways of living. So just to look at the dynamics in the systems level terms, at the macro systems level, a shift in local and regional attitudes about climate change because of the fire and the flood opened up an opportunity at the niche level for us to come in as a little experiment and unabashedly, very directly say, well, we want to disturb the regime here and try and destabilize it so it can transition to something else. And we have been very, very upfront about that. And these people are now going, okay, let's destabilize the regime. because they understand that nothing less than systems level change will work. So it's going to look like this. Ecologies of interventions in categories like these that are very diverse. So, of course, it's going to involve new policies about water and fire, but it's also changing people's behaviors and practices and attitudes about water. I mean, Americans have very, very funny ideas, I think, about hygiene. You know, we have to shower every day and wash our clothes after we've worn them once, and we wash our cars several times a week, and we put water all over our lawns, and that's all up here. Those are all attitudes that lead to unsustainable practices. So part of the transition design skill set is understanding the connection between the attitudes and the practices and the behaviors that they inform. It's all part of the system. And of course, it's going to involve both grassroots efforts and top-down efforts. But these changes in cultural norms, like changes in hygiene, changes, oh my God, a thing in California is you have all of these people moving from the East Coast because they're sick of the climate and the snow. So they move to California, but they want to have their green lawns and their fir trees and the exact same kind of landscaping as they had back east. But of course they can't have that unless they pump tons of water on it. So this again is a mindset, and it's a lack of appreciation for place-based ecosystems. All of that is the work of changing mindsets and changing the system. So all of these need to be connected to each other and the long-term vision. So solutions are going to look like this and many, many more. But of course, we come back to the problem of time. Now, if we stay with Ojai, and we're debating whether we should because it's so far away from us, we may transition it over to the University of Santa Barbara because it's in their backyard. I would work on this problem for the rest of my life before I probably saw significant results. Now, what about that? What about our own attention spans and our own propensity to get bored and move on to the next exciting thing? Or what about our tendency to go, this is just getting way too complicated and messy for me? So a lot of what transition design talks about is the work that we have to do on ourselves in order to even undertake this work. And I think it's going to challenge many of us to step back from postures of expertise. I mean, I'm 65 years old. I've been designing for 45 years now. It's so easy for me to just take up the posture of an expert. You know, and I'm trying to hold a room now, so I probably am acting like one. But we have to, I think, get good at watching our postures and knowing that nobody's an expert in doing this. Nobody knows how to do this. We are starting a conversation in hopes that people like Bob and his team will find it, go, hey, we'll talk to you about that. Hey, we'll work on some new areas of research, and collectively, maybe, just maybe, we can develop new tools and approaches that will lead to systems level change, because we don't have a choice. It feels to me like we have to try. And how do we do that when we in academia are supposed to be experts? We're supposed to know how to do everything. So I talk a lot to my students about switching postures. Like if you want to know how to make something look good in a PowerPoint slide and the letter spacing, oh boy, I can do that, I'm an expert. But I'm very careful to tell them when I'm stepping out of that, and I'm not so sure. I talk a lot about, I know this doesn't work and that hasn't worked, and this is why that hasn't worked. And we hypothesize with them. And I will say most of them, when we're honest, are absolutely fine with that. So this is the transition design framework, and it brings together an evolving set of practices, knowledge, and tool sets that we think is important for understanding systems and how to intervene in them. Visioning, I think we have to get more explicit about our theories of change, but also the knowledge sets that talk about change in systems. This is maybe, I think, the most important one. How can we take up postures that are not about certainty and rushing to solutions and ego-driven and ego-led? And how can we birth new paradigms, particularly within academia, about cooperation and sharing? I can't tell you how many times my university leadership is like, are you going to patent that? Are you going to own that? I'm like, no. The point is, it's going to be successful when nobody remembers where it came from. But that, too, is going to call for us taking up very different narratives with our institutions that are still kind of looking at things competitively. And then finally, we say that new ways of designing, and I should have qualified this at the very start of the talk. In our definition of design, we argue after Herbert Simon, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist and political scientist, who was at Carnegie Mellon a really long time ago. And his definition of design was changing existing situations into preferred ones. And another great designer, Victor Papanek, argued that everybody is always designing all the time, and that design is actually a ubiquitous human activity. So we call designing intention to change something. And in that regard, anyone in a transdisciplinary team that is working towards systems level change is designing for transition. These are some of the tools that we're working with, and most of them can be found on our Transition Design seminar, and we've now got about 20 universities around the world who are downloading them and trying to integrate transition design into research strands and coursework. And a lot of the tools are about enabling community. That's one last thing I'll say. I'll bet most of us in this room have participated at one time or another in a paradigm that says, I'm the expert, I'm coming into the community or I'm coming into the organization with my expertise, and I'm going to study your situation for about a minute. And then I'm going to go back to my studio and I'm going to cook up some solution. I'm going to present it to you and convince you it's right. And I might work with you for a little while, but then at some point, pretty quickly, I'm done, I'm gone. And the organization or the community's going, now what? And you're like, good luck with that. So it's kind of like the medical paradigm. You know, I go to my doctor, he says, don't talk to me, just answer my question. So how can we flip that to where we are actually showing up in service to communities and helping build their capacity from within to surface the innate wisdom and knowledge they have about how to solve their problem, how to empower stakeholders that have been disempowered, and perhaps teach the dare I say, arrogant ones who need to understand things about diversity and implicit bias and things like that. So how can we look at what each different stakeholder group needs and show up with the resources and the knowledge and the tools to help them do it so that you're also growing the capacity of the community to solve their own problems, leverage their wisdom, and have productive civic conversations among each other. And that, too, is a huge area of research. We've been working with somebody who's an adaptive leadership expert with the idea of taking them in and having them work with the Latino and Latina populations especially, because a lot of those people are not legal. And as I said earlier today, you do not want to be illegal in Trump's America. So what it does is it completely disempowers them. They don't have voice in civic conversations to surface their concerns. So that too is part of the systems work that needs to be undertaken. These are the other universities and even a few design firms that we're in conversation with. And we are going to be convening, I think, a gathering of representatives from all of these different institutions at Schumacher College next June at this time to hopefully discuss, should we form a network? Can it be about sharing knowledge? We've had discussions about what would it be like if you had maybe 5 or 6 cities in different places around the world, each working on a long-term transition design problem, and sharing information, developing new tools and research techniques, and then asking things like, what about the solutions or the interventions we're developing are unique to this place? And what about them is universal and can be shared? Like, the United States right now is so different than here. And the issues that we're dealing with are like, we're from another planet. But I'm sure there are problems that are common. And if we had someone in New Zealand, someone in Colombia, Mexico, the United States, the Netherlands, Norway, India, imagine the learning that could be pooled about systems level change and how cultural norms and the unique characteristics of the ecosystems we're embedded within could be shared. And as we were saying this morning, if we could have a story to tell about that, another wicked problem is changing the funding paradigm. To find funders who are truly interested in funding global change. And if you had a network that was pooling knowledge and you could show that these transitions were happening, that might help flip this capricious, we're going to fund this for a couple of years. No, we're bored with that. Now we're going to fund this. Now we're going to fund that. I mean, in the United States, it's just like a pinball machine. The funders are just all over the place. Somebody new comes in, oh, I don't care about that. I'm going to fund this. And it absolutely precludes any kind of systems approach because you can't connect anything up because you're having to follow the money. So part of the agenda, too, is turning that on its head, and possibly a coalition of people working around the world could have the potential to change that conversation. I also want to say our agenda is not to lead this. We are starting a conversation. I just stepped down as head of school 3 days ago, and I'm going to be launching a Transition Design Institute at Carnegie Mellon, and we're going to be working in our own backyard, but we really want to have colleagues around the world that can develop areas of research we can't, that understand things about the system we don't understand.